Don't worry, I haven't completely run out of ideas, but this subject generates considerable interest, although the average view duration of the original suggests it could be vastly improved. So here's the remastered version of BlackPill High. The argument of the original video is that the introduction of polyamory temporary monogamy into a sexual marketplace creates a dynamic where the creation of a unit class is an almost mathematical certainty. The model predicted 28%, and I would consider to be within a 1% margin of error to be pretty accurate. I made the original video before I saw Vox Day's video on the same subject, who postulates a very similar idea, although his ideas are slightly more developed. It may be a coincidence, but I have become increasingly suspicious how almost all aspects of the sexual revolution since the 60s, so often sold as some form of liberation, have the side effect of reducing the birth rate and population.
I don't think you can trust anybody.
The contraceptive pill, abortion, the obsession with the gender pay gap, the normalization and now encouragement of homosexuality, to the post-2016 transgender craze, the connection and obvious side effect of all of these is reducing the birth rate. The turf wars are a welcome and hilarious schism in our opponents' ranks, but it seems from J.K. Rowling to Kathleen Stock, the regime will generally side with the pro-trans argument, despite it often running roughshod over the recently won rights of women. The trans phenomenon is not a ground-up crusade. Caitlyn Jenner's award, speech, and subsequent media storm all had Edward Bernays written all over it. This is what aroused my suspicions about a hidden agenda. Now, you may consider this argument far-fetched, but we know from the now declassified National Security Study Memorandum 200, also known as the Kissinger Report, that attempts to control population using progressive social programs as cover, as well as overall global population control, have been on the agenda of the upper echelons of power since the 1970s. Indeed, when we see that the aforementioned Bernays, who quite literally wrote the book on propaganda, dedicated an entire chapter to its potential to help the fledgling women's movement, we see that the elites have been playing these games for a long time. But what is the method for transmitting this propaganda? I was skeptical about this idea for a long time, but Hollywood movies are the primary vehicle for this kind of large-scale social engineering. As Bernays writes on page 156, the American motion picture is the greatest unconscious carrier of propaganda in the world today. It is a great distributor for ideas and opinions. If you remain unconvinced, I would suggest you watch the BlackPill video, We Promise You're Unhappy, which is a superb analysis of the Stepford Wives, and also check out Nobody Will Remember Carl, which is a hauntingly poignant and beautiful work, and possibly my favourite ever YouTube video. Having lived through the entirety of the decade, it seems to me that the 90s new man...
I'm a 90s man. I cry when I need to. I share my feelings and I keep my mind open about everything.
And today's hysteria over toxic masculinity are both the same attempt to socially engineer men to be more effeminate, first with the carrot and then with the stick. Equally, both have shared a far greater popularity with the media class than with the wider public. Toward the end of Carol Quigley's mammoth text, Tragedy and Hope, there is a remarkable early conceptualization of a problem that is now widely recognized and well documented. In the American middle-class family of today, these influences have become extraordinarily exaggerated. Because the middle-class marriage is based on social rather than personal attraction, the emotional relation of the wife to her husband is insecure, and the more her husband buries himself in his work, hobbies, or outside interests, the more insecure and unsatisfactory it becomes for his wife. Part of the wife's unused emotional energy begins to be expended in her love for her son. At the same time, because of the emotional insecurity in the mother's relationship with her husband, the daughter may come to be regarded as an emotional rival for the husband's affection. This resentment of the daughter is most likely to occur when there is some other cause of disturbance in the mother's psychology, especially if this cause is associated with her relationship to her own father. For example, as female domination becomes, generation by generation, a more distinctive feature of American family life, the daughter's shift of attention to her father becomes less complete, and by adolescence, she tends to pity him rather than to admire him, and may become relatively ambivalent in her feelings towards both her father and mother, sometimes hating the latter for dominating her father and despising his weakness in allowing it. In such a case, the whole development of which we speak is accelerated and intensified in the next generation, and the daughter's relatively ambivalent feelings towards her parents are repeated in her relatively ambivalent feelings towards her husband. This serves to intensify both her emotional smothering and overprotection of her son and her tendency towards emotional rejection of her daughter as a potential danger to the relatively precarious emotional relationship between husband and wife. As a consequence of this situation, the frustrated wife has a tendency to cling to her son by keeping him dependent and immature as long as possible, and to seek to hasten the maturing of her daughter in order to edge her out of the family circle as soon as possible. The chief consequence of this is the increasingly late maturity, the weakness, undersexuality, and dependence of American boys and American men of middle-class origins, and the increasingly early maturing, aggressiveness, oversexuality, and independence of American middle-class girls. The mother's alienation of the daughter, which often reaches an acute condition of mutual hatred, may begin in childhood or even at birth, especially if the girl baby is beautiful, is not nursed by the mother, and is welcomed with excessive joy by the husband. It usually becomes acute when the daughter reaches puberty, and may become very acute if the mother about the same time is approaching her menopause, which she often mistakenly feels will reduce her attraction as a woman to her husband. During this whole period, the mother's rejection of her daughter appears chiefly in her efforts to force her to grow up rapidly, and leads to premature exposure of the daughter to such modern monstrosities as preteen mixed parties, training bras, access to overly sophisticated movies, books and conversations, and the practice of leaving daughters unchaperoned in the house with boy classmates on the early high school or even junior high school level. Such experiences and the increasingly frequent clashes of temperament between mother and daughter lead to a surprisingly large percentage of middle-class girls to move from the home before the age of 20. And whether she leaves or not, sexual and emotional maturity comes to the American middle-class girl earlier and earlier, not only in comparison with the middle-class boy, but even in absolute terms. We are told, for example, that the onset of puberty among American girls, an event which can be dated exactly by the first menstrual period.
No, I'm not going to ask about feminine hygiene issues on 4chan. You've got to relax with that site, man.
Has been occurring at an age earlier by about 9 months for each passing decade. As a result, this milestone is reached by American girls today up to 3 years earlier than with American girls of the early 20th century. Over the same period, the American middle-class boy has been moving in the opposite direction. Although the physiological element cannot be documented, indeed it need not be, more significant is the changing relationship between the arrival of sexual awareness and of emotional readiness to accept sex. There can be no doubt that the American child today, especially in a middle-class family, becomes aware of sex much earlier than he did a generation or two ago, and long before he is emotionally ready to face the fact of his own sexuality. In the 19th century, 3 things came fairly close together in the 15 to 17 age bracket: sexual awareness, emotional readiness for sex, and the ending of education and the opportunity to seek economic independence from parents. Today, sexual awareness comes very early for all, perhaps around the age of 10. Emotional readiness to face the fact of one's own sexuality comes earlier and earlier for the girl today, but later and later for the boy, chiefly because the middle-class mother forces independence and recognition of the fact that she is a woman upon her daughter, but forces dependence and blindness to the fact that he is a man upon her son. And the date for ending of education and seeking economic independence from parents gets somewhat later for girls, but immensely later for men, a process that becomes increasingly extravagant. One result of this is that the much greater, sometimes indefinitely postponed, delay for a boy of emotional readiness after sexual awareness leaves the boy emotionally desexed for so long that it affects his sexuality and emotional maturity adversely and to an increasingly advanced age. But the opposite is true for a girl. Because of the shorter and decreasing lag of her emotional readiness after her sexual awareness, Lolita, who is not as rare as the readers of that novel wanted to imagine, becomes increasingly frequent and cannot be satisfied by boys of her own age. Consequently, she seeks, for many reasons, including financial resources and greater emotional maturity, her sex companions among older men. On the other hand, the position of the middle-class boy becomes even more complex and pitiful, since he must not only face the fluctuating chronology of these developments to a much greater degree, but must free himself from his emotional dependence on his mother with little help from anyone. Now, I just find it bizarre that Bill Clinton and Nancy Pelosi both claim Quigley as a mentor, yet the Democratic Party that they've represented for decades seems more intent on making these problems worse than trying to find a solution. The potential benefits the elites stand to gain from the sexual revolution may possibly extend beyond population reduction, as this passage from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World suggests. In a little grassy bay between tall clumps of Mediterranean heather, two children, a little boy of about 7 and a little girl, who might have been a year older, were playing, very gravely and with all the focused attention of scientists intent on a labour of discovery, a rudimentary sexual game. "Charming, charming," the DHC repeated sentimentally. "Charming," the boys politely agreed, but their smile was rather patronising. They had put aside similar childish amusements too recently to be able to watch them now without a touch of contempt. Charming, but it was just a pair of kids fooling about. That was all. Just kids. I always think the director was continuing in the same rather maudlin tone when he was interrupted by a loud boo-hooing. From a neighbouring shrubbery emerged a nurse, leading by the hand a small boy who howled as he went. An anxious-looking little girl trotted at her heels. "What's the matter?" asked the director. The nurse shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing much," she answered. "It's just this little boy seems rather reluctant to join in the ordinary erotic play. I noticed it once or twice before, and now again today. He started yelling just now." "Honestly," put in the anxious-looking little girl, "I didn't mean to hurt him or anything. Honestly." "Of course you didn't, dear," said the nurse reassuringly. "And so," she went on, turning back to the director, "I'm taking him in to see the assistant superintendent of psychology, just to see if anything's at all abnormal." "Quite right," said the director. "Take him in. You stay here, little girl," he added, as the nurse moved away with her still howling charge. "What's your name?" "Polly Trotsky." "And a very good name too," said the director. "Run away now and see if you can't find some other little boy to play with." The child scampered off into the bushes and was lost to sight. Now, there's been a lot of arguing over the concept of childhood innocence recently, but I think we can all agree that children go through a non-sexual phase before they hit puberty, and this phase is key to developing skills that will help you be successful later in life. Teenage Casanovas rarely become giants of science or industry, and I know people say this is meant to be a joke, but it's not funny and it's not clever. It used to feel like the sexual revolution was something from the past rather than an ongoing process that was continuously evolving. We can illustrate this by examining 3 coming-of-age movies released over a roughly 30-year period. Cult classic Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the cheesy but fun American Pie, and the god-awful affront to cinema that is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Fast Times revolves around the lives and loves of teenagers Brad and Stacey Hamilton, Linda Barrett, Mark Ratner, and Mike Damone, as Linda and Mike coach the romantic lives of Stacey and Mark, respectively.
Well, naturally something happens. I mean, you put the vibe out to 30 million chicks, something is going to happen.
That's the idea, Raz. That's the attitude.
The attitude?
Yeah, the attitude dictates that you don't care whether she comes, stays, lays, or prays. I mean, whatever happens, your toes are still tapping. Now, when you got that, then you have the attitude.
Comic relief is provided by the character of Jeff Spicoli, who is the archetype of every dopey stoner character in movies from Bill and Ted to Jay and Silent Bob.
Wait a minute, there's no birthday party for me here.
Released in 1982, the film would probably have been considered fairly risque for the time, with Roger Ebert describing it as a scuzz pit of a movie. But beneath the crude humour, there was an honest portrayal of believable characters.
Linda, I finally figured it out. I don't want sex. Anyone can have sex.
Yeah, Stacy, what do you want?
I want a relationship. I want romance.
You want romance in Ridgemont? We can't even get cable TV here, Stacy. You want romance.
This is partly because Cameron Crowe spent a year undercover at a San Diego high school and wrote the screenplay based on his experiences there. Despite the film's vulgarity, the characters grow and learn positive lessons. And at the end, the right characters are rewarded and punished, and the film exists within a recognizable moral universe. I will always have a nostalgic fondness for American Pie, having watched it in my youth during a trip to Connecticut. The film is centered around the quartet of Jim, Kevin, Oz, and Finch, who all make a pact to lose their virginity before prom.
You know we're all going to go to college as virgins. You realize this, right? I mean, they probably have special dorms for people like us.
All right, I got an idea. But it's got to stay between us. It's really simple. We just got to make an agreement. Or, no, it's more than an agreement.
What, a bet?
A pact. No money involved, more important than any bet.
The film has plenty of parallels with Fast Times, and seems to inhabit a similar moral universe, with characters punished and rewarded for their conduct, and Jim discovers he is more likely to be successful in romantic matters when he stops obsessing over them.
Come on, I mean, we made a pact. You can't break that. You guys are just gonna have to...
Have to what, Kev? Huh? I don't have to do shit. You know, forget it already. I am so sick and tired of all this bullshit pressure. I mean, I've never even had sex, and already I can't stand it. I hate sex! And I'm not gonna stand around here busting my balls over something that, quite frankly, isn't that damn important. Now, I'm gonna go hang out with that geek over there, because at least she has something else to talk about besides sex.
Zoomers often want to know how things have changed since the 90s. The best way I can describe it is in my changing attitude towards the characters of Finch and his nemesis, the Stiffmeister. When I watched as a teenager, I related far more to Finch than the boorish Stifler, but looking back from 2022, Stifler is an anarchic anti-hero of freedom and fun, whereas Finch now appears as the prototype soy boy. This was not the only troubling trend that appears in American Pie.
Oh, what's your major?
Postmodern feminist thought.
Cool.
I doubt modern Hollywood would make a film like this today, particularly the Nadia scene, but ultimately it has the same strengths as Fast Times. Realistic and believable, albeit exaggerated, portrayals of the teenagers who live at the time the film was made. But it will probably be best remembered for this contribution to the modern vocabulary.
Stifler's mom? Yep.
Shit. cannot believe a fine woman like this produced a guy like Stifler.
Dude!
That chick's a MILF.
The hell's that?
MILF. Mom, I'd like to fuck.
Yeah, dude. Oh, yeah.
I only heard about this film through the hilarious Negative XP song, so I went in with low expectations, but was still disappointed. Maybe I'm just getting old, but in the 11 years after the release of American Pie, the world has become almost unrecognisable. The weakness of this film is the strength of the two others. The characters simply do not resemble anyone I have ever met, while their actions and reactions are unrealistic and inhuman. I don't know what happens in the end, as I turned off after this ridiculous scene where some guy steals his friend's boyfriend, there is a subpar High School Musical number, and a massive cringe fest of a fight scene. I think the plot is that in order to win the heart of rude, nonchalant bitch with bad hair, Ramona Flowers, Gamma Boy must defeat her 7 ex-lovers, who all have superpowers for some reason. So, yeah, we can consider that fridge well and truly nuked. And to the people involved in making this movie, I just want you to know that you make Michael Bay look like Stanley Kubrick. We have reached the point where our obsession with gender is impacting the West's credibility and creating tensions with other powers. At the same time, reforms do not always deliver what their proponents have promised. Traditions are often solutions to problems we forgot we had. And the problem with the modern gender revolution is that gender stereotypes are often what men and women find attractive about one another.
Looking to the future, and this also links to the other question, I'm not sure there'll still be genders in 50 or 100 or 150 years.
The motivation for this Nosferatu-faced Calibanic monstrosity to destroy gender is simply vengeance fueled by his own inadequacy. Although I can sympathise with those who would wish to shut the Pandora's box of the sexual revolution, I fear it would be an impossible task. But the last thing to leave Pandora's box is hope. And we can hope that as many people as possible will realise